The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. In the gray dawn of a summer day in 1642, the Puritan settlement of Boston stirred with a grim anticipation. The townsfolk gathered before the heavy oak door of the prison, their faces set with righteous judgment. From the crowd's murmurs, a young woman emerged, her head bowed under the weight of their stares. Hester Prynne, once a figure of quiet beauty, now bore a scarlet letter, A, emblazoned on her chest, its vivid hue a stark contrast to her somber gown. In her arms, she cradled a 3-month-old infant, Pearl, whose innocent eyes seemed to defy the crowd's condemnation. The marketplace buzzed with whispers. Hester, convicted of adultery, was to stand on the scaffold for 3 hours, a public spectacle of her sin. The magistrates, stern in their black robes, and the ministers, led by the venerable Reverend John Wilson, watched from above. Among them stood Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, a young clergyman whose pale face and trembling hands betrayed an inner turmoil unnoticed by the crowd. Hester's husband, long absent and presumed lost at sea, left her crime partnerless in the eyes of the law, and she bore the punishment alone. As Hester stood on the scaffold, her beauty undimmed by shame, a figure caught her eye at the crowd's edge. A man, small and weathered, with one shoulder higher than the other, stared at her with cold, penetrating eyes. She recognized him instantly. Her husband, Roger Chillingworth, returned from years of captivity among the Indians. His gaze chilled her, but she met it with silence, refusing to name her lover despite the magistrate's demands. Reverend Wilson pressed her, and Dimmesdale, in a voice soft yet piercing, urged her to speak, claiming it might save her soul. Hester's resolve held firm. "I will not speak," she declared, and the crowd muttered in disapproval. Released from the scaffold, Hester was confined to a life of ostracism. She and Pearl lived in a small cottage on the town's outskirts, near the forest, where Hester earned a living by her needlework, crafting garments for the very community that shunned her. The Scarlet Letter, meant to mark her disgrace, became a symbol of her skill, its intricate embroidery a testament to her resilience. Yet the letter burned into her spirit, a constant reminder of her sin and isolation. Pearl, her daughter, grew into a child of wild beauty, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond her years. She was both Hester's joy and torment, a living embodiment of her sin. The townsfolk called Pearl a demon child, her impish behavior and fascination with the Scarlet Letter fueling their suspicions. Hester dressed her in bright colors, a defiant contrast to her own subdued attire, as if to shield Pearl from the gloom of their existence. Yet Pearl's questions about the letter, "What does it mean, Mother?" cut deeply, and Hester could only answer with vague promises of future truths. Meanwhile, Roger Chillingworth, under his assumed name, established himself as a physician in Boston. His learning and skill earned him respect, but his true purpose was darker. He sought the identity of Hester's lover, his heart consumed by a quiet, vengeful resolve. His eyes, ever watchful, fell upon Arthur Dimmesdale, whose health began to fail under an unseen burden. Chillingworth, sensing a connection, offered his services to the young minister, and the two took lodgings together. The physician's probing questions and constant presence became a torment to Dimmesdale, whose frail body and haunted demeanor hinted at a soul in agony. Dimmesdale, revered for his eloquence and piety, preached sermons that moved his congregation to tears. Yet his words often turned to the anguish of hidden sin, as if confessing through veiled metaphors. He fasted, prayed, and scourged himself in secret, seeking relief from the guilt that gnawed at his heart. The Scarlet Letter, though worn only by Hester, seemed to sear his own chest in private moments of despair. At night, unable to bear his solitude, he would climb the scaffold under cover of darkness, imagining a public confession that never came. One such night, 7 years after Hester's punishment, Dimmesdale stood on the scaffold, his heart a storm of remorse. By chance, Hester and Pearl passed by, returning from a deathbed vigil. Seeing the minister, Hester joined him, and Pearl clasped his hand. For a moment, the three stood united, a family bound by sin and secrecy. A meteor streaked across the sky, casting a red glow that formed a vast A in the heavens. To the townsfolk, it signified angel, marking the passing of Governor Winthrop that night. To Dimmesdale, it was a divine accusation. Chillingworth, watching from the shadows, smiled with a sinister understanding, his suspicion of Dimmesdale's guilt now certain. As years passed, Hester's quiet dignity softened the town's judgment. Her charity, nursing the sick, comforting the poor, earned her a reluctant respect. Some began to call the Scarlet Letter a mark of Abel rather than adulteress. Yet Hester carried an inner sorrow, her spirit chastened by the weight of her sin and the Puritan laws that defined her. She wondered if her punishment was just, her thoughts drifting to the forest, a place beyond the town's rigid bounds where truth might live unshackled. One day, Hester sought Dimmesdale in the forest, determined to reveal Chillingworth's identity and urge the minister to flee his tormentor. She found him by a brook, his face hollow, his steps faltering. In the wild, green sanctuary, they spoke openly for the first time in years. Hester confessed that Chillingworth was her husband, and Dimmesdale, overwhelmed, forgave her, though he despaired at the physician's relentless pursuit. Their love, long buried, rekindled briefly, and Hester urged him to escape with her and Pearl to Europe, where they might live free of shame. Dimmesdale, torn between hope and guilt, agreed, his heart lifted by the dream of a new life. Pearl, playing nearby, resisted Dimmesdale's affection, her wild spirit sensing his divided heart. She pointed to the Scarlet Letter, demanding its meaning, but Hester could not answer. The forest, with its fleeting promise of freedom, could not erase the reality of their sin or the society awaiting them. Dimmesdale returned to town, his resolve wavering, while Hester prepared for their departure. Chillingworth, ever vigilant, sensed their plan. His knowledge of Dimmesdale's guilt deepened his vengeance, and he secured passage on the same ship Hester intended to take, determined to follow them. Meanwhile, Dimmesdale's health worsened, his sermons growing feverish with visions of judgment. On election day, as the town gathered for a grand procession, he delivered a sermon of unparalleled power, his voice soaring with divine inspiration. The crowd marveled, unaware of the storm within him. As the procession moved to the marketplace, Dimmesdale, pale and unsteady, broke from the magistrates and climbed the scaffold. Calling Hester and Pearl to his side, he tore open his shirt, revealing a faint red mark on his chest, a scarlet letter etched by guilt and suffering. "I am the sinner," he cried, confessing his adultery to the stunned crowd. He spoke of God's mercy and justice, his words a final plea for redemption. Collapsing in Hester's arms, he kissed Pearl, who wept human tears for the first time, her wild nature softened by his sacrifice. With a final prayer, Dimmesdale died, his soul at last unburdened. The crowd stood in awe and confusion. Some swore they saw a clear scarlet letter on Dimmesdale's chest. Others denied it, claiming his confession was merely a parable. Chillingworth, robbed of his vengeance, withered in spirit and died within a year, leaving his wealth to Pearl. Hester and Pearl left Boston, their whereabouts unknown for a time. Years later, Hester returned alone, old and gray, to her cottage by the forest. She resumed her life of quiet service, wearing the scarlet letter not as punishment, but as a chosen emblem of her past. Women in distress sought her counsel, finding solace in her hard-won wisdom. Pearl, it was said, thrived abroad, married, and bore children, her life untouched by the shadow of her mother's sin. Hester, in her final years, was buried beside Dimmesdale in the King's Chapel graveyard, their shared tombstone bearing a simple inscription. A scarlet A on a black field, a symbol of sin, suffering, and perhaps salvation.